Imagine yourself standing in the scorching heat of the Colosseum in the year 80. The roar of 50,000 spectators hits you like a physical wave, screaming for blood and entertainment. You look down at the golden sand of the arena, which is already soaked with dark crimson blood. There stands the victor, a muscular giant of a man, breathing heavily, his chest heaving with adrenaline and exhaustion. In popular movies and scandalous novels, this is the moment where the emperor or the crowd offers him a trembling female prisoner as a reward for his bravery. We have all seen the scenes where the rugged hero claims the helpless woman right there in the dust, or drags her off to his cell for unspeakable acts. But pause right here and let me ask you a serious question. Do you really think the Romans, with their strict social hierarchy and obsession with order, would allow a slave such a privilege? The reality of what happened to female prisoners and how gladiators actually interacted with women is far more disturbing, complex, and surprising than any Hollywood fantasy could ever dream up. The truth is not about romance or immediate gratification, but about a brutal system of exploitation that permeated every layer of Roman society. To understand the shocking truth, you first have to realize what a gladiator actually was in the eyes of a Roman citizen. Despite their fame and the roaring crowds chanting their names, gladiators were legally defined as infamis. This meant they were social outcasts, stripped of almost all rights, on the same level as prostitutes and gravediggers. They were property, expensive investments owned by a lanista who managed their training, their diet, and their lives down to the smallest detail. A racehorse does not get to decide what prize it takes home after the derby, and neither did a gladiator. The idea that a gladiator could simply claim a female prisoner, who was technically the property of the state or the sponsor of the games, is historically laughable. So if the victorious fighter did not get the girl, what actually happened to the female prisoners who were dragged into the arena? This is where the story takes a turn into the truly macabre and horrific. These women were usually convicted criminals, prisoners of war or slaves who had displeased their masters in some grievous way. They were not prizes to be won, but victims to be executed in the most theatrical and humiliating ways imaginable. The Romans loved to reenact mythological stories, and they used these women as disposable props in their twisted plays. You might see a woman dressed as Dirce, tied to the horns of a raging bull to be torn apart, while the crowd cheered at the realism of the scene. Sometimes they were forced to participate in reenactments of the myth of Pasiphae, involving actual beasts in acts that are too grotesque to describe in detail. These were public executions designed to strip the victim of all humanity before they died. For a gladiator to intervene or claim one of these women would have been a direct insult to the emperor and the carefully choreographed spectacle of justice. However, this does not mean that gladiators lived life like monks without any female companionship. The irony is that while they could not claim prisoners, they were often the most desired men in the entire empire. Archaeologists have found graffiti preserved on the walls of Pompeii that reveals the shocking obsession Roman women had with these fighters. One inscription describes a gladiator named Celidus as the man who makes the girls sigh. Another refers to Crescens the net fighter as the doctor to the girls in the night, implying a very specific kind of healing. This was the dirty little secret of Roman society. While high-born women publicly scorned these slaves, privately, they fetishized them. Wealthy matrons would pay massive sums of money to the lanista for a private hour, with a famous champion in his cell. The gladiator was not the predator claiming a prize, but rather he was the product being sold by his pimp to a wealthy buyer. It was a complete reversal of the movie trope. The gladiator was the one being used. The obsession went so deep that it even extended to the physical byproducts of the arena. You will not believe this, but the sweat and dirt scraped from the skin of a victorious gladiator was collected, bottled, and sold as a high-end cosmetic item. Roman women would buy this mixture, known as gloios, and rub it into their faces or mix it into their perfumes. They believed the essence of the fighter's vitality and strength would transfer to them, making them irresistible. Can you imagine the modern equivalent of buying a bottle of sweat from a famous boxer to use as a face cream? It shows just how deep the superstition and sexual mania surrounding these men actually went. But let us go back to the female prisoners for a moment, because their fate was often intertwined with the gladiators in a different, darker way. Sometimes, female prisoners were not just passive victims, but were forced to fight as gladiatrices. This was rare and often considered a novelty act, but it happened, particularly under emperors like Domitian and Nero, who loved the bizarre. In these cases, a male gladiator might find himself facing a woman in the arena, or women would fight each other to the death. The historical record tells us of a spectacle in the year 63, where Ethiopian women were forced to fight wild beasts. If a male gladiator was pitted against a female prisoner, his job was not to seduce her, but to slaughter her efficiently, to please the crowd. Hesitation would have been seen as weakness, and a weak gladiator did not survive long in the Colosseum. The crowd demanded blood, and the gender of the opponent mattered far less than the quality of the kill. Yet there is another layer to the gladiator's private life that contradicts the image of the solitary beast. Many gladiators, especially the successful ones who survived multiple fights, actually had wives and children living with them in the Ludus. These were not prisoners, they had claimed, but usually women of low social status, often former slaves or freed women, who chose to build a life with a man who could die any day. We have found tombstones with heartbreaking inscriptions written by grieving wives for their fallen husbands. One reads, "To my dear husband, who deserved a longer life, erected by his loving wife." This proves that for the gladiator, the woman in his life was a source of comfort and stability in a world of chaotic violence. He did not need to rape a prisoner in the dust of the arena because he had a family waiting for him, praying he would come back alive. Now consider the psychological toll this double life must have taken on these men. By day, they were killing machines, slaughtering animals, criminals, and fellow gladiators while the crowd screamed for more gore. By night, they were fathers and husbands, trying to maintain a shred of humanity in a prison where they were constantly watched. The rumor that gladiators were awarded women as sex slaves likely stems from a misunderstanding of the Roman concept of war booty. When a Roman legion conquered a city, the soldiers were indeed allowed to loot and take captives, but a gladiator fight was not a war. It was a religious ceremony turned into a spectator sport, governed by strict rules and rituals. Lanista ran a business, and giving away valuable prisoners to slaves would have been terrible for his profit margins. Instead, if a gladiator wanted a woman, he had to pay for a prostitute with the coins he earned from his victories. Yes, gladiators were paid a portion of the prize money, and successful ones could become quite wealthy over time. They could buy their own food, better armor, and yes, the company of women, but it was a transaction, not a rite of conquest. The most shocking aspect of all this is perhaps the story of the Emperor Commodus. He was the emperor who famously liked to play gladiator, stepping into the arena to fight safely against opponents who were armed with wooden swords. It is said that he would order the wives of his political enemies to be brought to the arena, not to be killed, but to be raped in the corridors under the stands while the games went on above. This horrific abuse of power by an emperor might have bled into the mythology of the gladiator, confusing the tyrant's crimes with the fighter's life. But for the true gladiator, the man in the iron mask, life was far more disciplined and restricted. Let us look at the famous revolt of Spartacus to see how gladiators treated women when they were actually free. When Spartacus and his 70 gladiators broke out of the school in Capua, they did not just run wild raping and pillaging immediately. They were disciplined, they organized, and many of them brought their wives with them on the campaign. This implies that these relationships existed before the revolt, and were deep enough to survive the perils of a war against Rome. It completely shatters the image of the mindless brute, who sees women only as objects to be conquered. But what about the Vestal Virgins, the most holy women in Rome who had the front row seats at the games? These women had the power to save a fallen gladiator with a gesture, yet they were sworn to absolute chastity, under penalty of being buried alive. There was a strange, electric tension between the blood-soaked gladiator in the sand and the pristine, white-clad virgin in the box. The gladiator represented the raw, chaotic force of nature and death, while the Vestal represented the sacred, eternal flame of Rome. Their interaction was purely symbolic, yet it was one of the most charged moments in the entire spectacle. If a gladiator fell and raised his finger for mercy, he would look to the Vestals and the Emperor, not to a prisoner he wanted to claim. The power of life and death lay in the hands of women, but it was the women in the VIP box, not the ones in the arena. So, the next time you watch a movie and see the hero casually throw a woman over his shoulder after a fight, remember the grim reality. Remember that the woman in the arena was likely moments away from being mauled by a lion or executed by a sword. Remember that the gladiator was a slave who might be sold for sex later that night to a woman who despised him in public. And remember that the sweat on his brow was worth more to the crowd than his happiness or his freedom. The Roman arena was not a place for romantic conquests. It was a factory of death, where everyone played a role. The prisoner died to show Rome's justice,